to our conversation. Cameron and Anita Scott. Rosanna will be back next week. I think her vacation ends. Thank you, Jesus. On Sunday, I'll be sure enough glad when she comes back. We got a lot to talk about. No disrespect, Cameron. We're very happy to have you. Don't misunderstand me. A lot to talk about. Lots happening in the battle for democracy, ranging from a new government in waiting that the extreme right is trying to put in place even a year and a half before the election, to attempts to remove Supreme Court justices in Wisconsin. Well, we'll get to all of it when we get to it, and then there are big issues taking place in the country with respect to police repression, a murder of a pregnant woman in Columbus, and then a very positive development in Chicago. Come back to that as well. Auto workers poised to strike on Thursday if they don't reach an agreement with the big three. We'll be talking about that. And then finally, our mailbag question. But first, um, let's frame this issue of the battle for democracy. You all remember the great Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci, don't you? And Gramsci was noted for popularizing the United Front concept, which he termed the struggle for democracy and hegemony. Hegemony, that was his term for the United Front. And he argued that the revolution in a undeveloped country like Russia or China, or back then India or some of the Latin American countries, was one thing. But in the advanced capitalist countries, um, uh, instead of a direct view of the state and government, that there were a number of what he called moats or battlements, trenches between people and the ruling class. Um, and that required a different kind of strategy, you know, um, where the struggle for power was not direct, but indirect, and that the working class movement had to employ a number of different strategies in order to win the battle for democracy and take state power. And he described that as a war of position, Anita, war
Hmm.
of position. And what happened in Russia, where they seized the Winter Palace, that was described as a war of maneuver. You just went and grabbed the power and took it. China, Cuba, Russia, so on and so forth.
Hmm.
Can't do that in the big capitalist countries, and we're seeing um, a very protracted struggle taking place in our country and in many other countries uh, against the extreme right, and it's taking place on many, many different forms. Like, for example, you have the uh, uh, prosecutor Fonnie Willis in Georgia prosecuting Trump under Rico. Is that a good thing, Anita? Under that
Well,
racketeering?
I think what you may be getting at is that Fonnie Willis has overused the Rico statute, or she's been accused of that by going after the teachers in Georgia, and also some hip hop artists, I think, are under Rico charges as well. Um, I think we need to, I think what Donald Trump did to this country in trying to overthrow democracy and in the highest election, the presidential election in 2020, I think really he needs to be held accountable for that. And if she chooses to use this law, I think we should throw everything we can at trying to prevent him from ever being our president again. And I hope that either Fonnie Willis's case or Jack Smith's or any number of the people who are suing to have him barred from the ballot. I hope one or all of them are successful, because I just fear so much what a second Trump term would do to this country, as we've read about.
Scott, uh, the racketeering charges under Rico used against Trump is also being used against the Cop City protesters. 60 were arraigned under these Rico charges, which hold that, if you're doing something that's breaking the law, whether or not you know it's breaking the law or not, and you're involved in what they call a conspiracy, that you're as culpable as the people who know what they're doing. Uh, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think, first of all, as Marxists, that is, as people who recognize the class nature of society, who recognize that there's not some neutral position from which to evaluate, how institutions work and what they do. Um, like, yeah, the use of RICO laws to crack down on the Cop City protesters in Atlanta is wrong, and we oppose it. It's an attack on people's right to assemble and protest and try to um, exercise some kind of influence in their city. On the other hand, using it to um, go after Trump and his associates, his co-conspirators, or what have you, um, is is absolutely correct. And what I liked about the use of RICO against Trump was, I believe there was some the rationale for it was that this conspiracy of Trump and those around him who tried to overturn the results of the election, it was to defraud the American electorate, to defraud voters of some sort of fundamental right of theirs, to take away something that belonged to them, which is exactly what they tried to do. They tried to take away the power that rightfully belonged to voters. So to say, that because, yeah, we can't say that RICO charges are right or wrong in the abstract, right? It depends on the situation. It depends on, um, yeah. That's I guess that's all I have to say on it.
But Cameron, is it really so relative as Scott is arguing? I mean, isn't this a two-edged sword that can be used by the ruling class in whatever way they choose? What do you think?
Um, well, yeah, it can be used either way, and it depends on relative balance of forces on the ground and in government how it's going to be used. Um, I think it being used against Trump is a good thing. I agree with Scott and Anita on that. And within the balance of bourgeois democracy and within the context of a broader struggle against the extreme right, it's doing what it should, which is to protect the basic institutions that people have to struggle for power. Um, with respect to the protesters in Atlanta, um, um, or some of these other wrong uses, it reflects at the same time the undue, or it reflects the fact that the right wing has power it should not have and that we don't want it to have. Um, and it also is being used actually to undermine bourgeois democracy itself. Um, Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, these are things that are supposed to be rights under our capitalist constitution. Um, and RICO is being used to undermine even that. Um, and I agree with what Scott is saying. We have to use a working class yardstick to measure um, when it's being used to harm, and when it's being used appropriately within the situation that we have.
Yeah, but to me, this is a two-edged sword. Be careful what you ask for, because if this was a law that was initially developed against the mob, against the mafia, And if it can be used against Trump and them, and if it can be used against the Cop City protesters, 60 of them arrested the other day, it can be used against us. We're not in a position to determine how it's used. The ruling class is. So I think this is something that we need to look back into in a subsequent show. Maybe we'll get a lawyer to join us, because how we fight and the circumstances under which we fight are really important, and the laws that are used. I remember that I think it was the McCarran Act that was initially used against the Socialist Workers Party. That was the same act that they used, or maybe it was the Smith Act that they used against the party several years later. But let's come back to that in a subsequent show. Anita, the Heritage Foundation, they got a blueprint going on and setting up a government in waiting. They want to replace the administrative state uh, uh, and bring into power a new form of government. How would you characterize that new form of government that they're trying to put in place?
I would say they're trying to destroy the administrative state, and to do that, they're using different tools, but the same goal as Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court and other members of the Supreme Court are trying to undercut the administrative state from the judicial angle. It's really a sinister plot to really seize control of. I mean, it's almost, well, they accuse Democrats of having a deep state or whatever. Apparently, deep state means anybody who's independent. These agencies were set up, administrative agencies were set up by Congress to have some independence and to be able to make rational data-based decision making. And what this project 2025 does is it takes all of that independence and autonomy away from these agencies and gives it all to the president, who can just fire at will any member of those agencies and just impose his will on the way and the entire executive branch is functioning. It's just outrageous. It's a plan for a fascist state, and they're putting it right out there. They're paying $22 million or something to put it together, and there are personnel lists and all kinds of transition plans they have in mind. It's really frightening and sinister.
Scott, they used a administrative rule called Schedule F that was put in place during the Trump administration, where they can reclassify tens of thousands of government workers who have a certain amount of rights now. So they're trying to legally change their classification so that they can dismiss them at will, and replace them with whoever they want, or just get rid of them if they so choose. And we saw that they were doing things like that in the previous Trump regime in the State Department, where they gutted it. But do these institutions really have independence? And um, is there really strong opposition on the part of the bureaucracy to what Trump and them are doing?
Well, I think we have to be clear that when we talk about these, the administrative state that Trump and that lot are always on about, what they're talking about is like the people who are in charge of regulating industries, the people at the EPA who actually do the work of gathering data and making decisions, the people who make sure civil rights regulations are being respected. The the people who the yeah the all of the apparatus, all of the set of people that make the government work, make the executive branch work. And this is not only an attack on federal workers who will be reclassified as we saw, it's an attempt to sweep away any obstacles to a Republican president implementing whatever batshit policy they want, and sweeping through with no opposition. Because we saw in the first Trump regime, as you mentioned, Joe, there was resistance. There were resistance from leaders and kind of mid-level bureaucrats as well in the various departments. The National Park Service was really aggressively opposed to him, and that resistance was important. It kept some of the worst stuff from being put in place, and without it, we'd be in a much worse position. So yeah, this is a real fight.
The National Park Service, Cameron, Scott is arguing is part of the deep state, along with the CIA and the FBI and the National Security Council and so on and so forth. But isn't in fact there a deep state, and shouldn't we be in favor of breaking up its influence on the federal government?
Well, personally, I'm not a big fan of the term deep state. I think there's just a state. But I think probably what people are referring to is, yeah, the repressive apparatuses of the state, and especially components of it are not really under democratic oversight the way the police certainly are not really under democratic oversight. They do their own thing, and too many of our politicians are afraid of the police, who they're supposed to be in charge of. And same thing with the army. Yeah, I ultimately want to put these things under democratic control of the people. And long-term vision for communism is that to get rid of the police and not have an army and things like that. I think certainly if the Communist Party was in power, along with a wider coalition, we would want to get rid of the CIA. But I also agree with what Scott is saying, that I think that what they're really after is these regulatory bodies that have the task that should be regulating business much more forcefully than and stringently than they are, and especially with regard to the fossil fuel companies and things like this. I think they want to get rid of any agencies that have the responsibility of regulating big business. But certainly, I think it's a big trick to suggest that the CIA and the police and the military are somehow not assets of the extreme right. They are.
Anita, we are in favor of radical reform of the state. We want to see a new form of governance take place, don't we? So what's the difference between what Trump and them are trying to do? And by the way, I think it was Bannon. That's that name you were looking for, Scott, who along with Trump were popularizing the idea of the administrative state, deconstruction of the administrative state. But Anita, what's the difference between what they're trying to do and what the left is in favor of in terms of a radical reform of the state?
Well, I think the left would prefer to see, just sort of like Scott said, wants to see those agencies act even more on behalf of the working class and the people themselves. In fact, this week in cpusa.org, there's an article that was reprinted from the People's World about how OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Agency, has failed to develop guidelines to protect workers from extreme heat stroke. I know Governor Abbott canceled something that demanded that workers have breaks for water and rest during extreme heat situations. So I think I think we can see there that even though there's so a, ostensibly pro-labor administration in the White House, um, there are still elements of those agencies that are really beholden to the special to the ruling class, and I think that's what we would like to see eradicated. We would like to see those agencies really work on behalf of the working class and the people in general, and not the special interests, not the for-profit corporations.
But Scott, isn't the issue not whether or not those agencies work for the workers and poor and the people, but whether or not they're controlled by? Isn't that the issue? The because isn't there a class struggle taking place over um, who uh, works on behalf of who and who controls what? Isn't
Well,
that the essence of the problem?
the question of who controls them and who they work for are not really separate questions. Uh, the way this sort of presents itself in my mind is that yes, we want. I don't like the formulation of radical reform of the state. We want a revolution. We want to replace a capitalist state with a state where the working class holds power, and that means a total rearranging, reorganization of how power works. Um, uh, so what we see, I think, is these fascist forces kind of seizing on the discontent that people have, the understanding that people are beginning to develop that the government does not work for them in any consistent way. But instead of posing the real solution, which is a mass movement to win more advanced reforms and eventually revolution, there's this um, sort of horrifying shortcut of fascism. Like, oh yeah, we're just going to sweep away all of the, you know, the IRS and the EPA and the Department of Education and this and that. That's not a solution. So I guess I'm not sure where you're going with the question of like the difference between who's in control and who they serve. The broad democratic movement needs to be in control of these, and eventually the working class needs to be in control of the entire apparatus of the state.
But isn't it necessary to have a radical reform of the state before the working class can seize power? I mean, in Chicago, they put in place a commission for public safety and accountability as a means of empowering Black and Latino and working class, white and Asian uh, influence and control over the police. That's a
I mean,
progressive,
so
radical reform
are
of the police. They're not able to seize state power in the city of Chicago or in the state of Illinois.
are you suggesting some sort of equivalence between the attack on the, I don't know, whatever, the administrative state or the deep state, and the the civilian, um, the police, the Public Safety and Accountability Commission in Chicago?
No, I'm asking a very simple question. What's the difference between what is being attempted on the right, which is a seizure of power on behalf of certain sections of the ruling class, on the one hand, to further ruling class interests, and what uh, d- democratic, pro people, pro working class, radical uh, positions with respect to battling for democracy might look like.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's it. You summed it up. That's exactly it. Like, there's an um, attack on um, democratic institutions on one side. On the other side, there is an attempt to reform, reinvigorate, um, develop new ways of the people holding and exercising power. So they're diametrically opposed. You know what what the Heritage Foundation and the extreme right are talking about, and what's happening in Chicago, which I think we'll talk about in a moment with the civilian or the Commission on Public Safety and Accountability.
Community Commission on Public Safety and Accountability. Cameron, they yesterday approved a law to get rid of, the police departments had accumulated a list of 128,000 names, 70% of whom were black, 28% of whom were Latino, 3%, no, 5% were white. They had them on this gang list. And they had people on the list who were 114 years old. and 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 if you were on the gang list, you can imagine, difficulties getting a job, difficulties getting bail, difficulties getting you were getting on a plane, and so one of the initial things that this new commission that was elected last year has been able to do has been to get rid of that list and to work for a new way of approaching the whole problem of identifying who and how policing is exercised. That was a big development, no?
Certainly. And, as you're speaking, two things come to mind, with respect to the whole question of what is the difference between, people's approach, working class approach, and, extreme right approach to these state apparatuses, is that this included a long-term struggle that's been going on for a long time, from the bottom up, people organizing their communities to establish, new institutions governed by people that give them, power in the hands of the people to begin to control these institutions, not being swept away supposedly from above by, forces that have already made their hostility to us known. But yeah, it shows, what can be done when new institutions controlled, people controlled institutions are put in place, and this is moving in the direction of community controlled police. It's a huge victory. And the other thing that comes to mind when you're speaking is the whole idea of repression. When you put on a gang list, um, especially, and when the majority of those people are people of color, um, what else can you call that except political repression? Um, Especially when I read one point, it says very few people were members of white supremacist groups, for example. So it's significant that this is also a big part of what the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression is all about. Yeah.
And on that end of the long struggle, just going back to what Cameron said, it was long. It was, I think, over a decade of just relentless struggle. We sometimes say from the streets to the ballot box and back, right? It was going out, talking to people, having conversations, getting petitions signed, canvassing, working on elections, and then pressuring people who were elected, and then back out in the streets, and just, I mean, the amount of work that this took. And I was there for part of the period when the push for what they were calling at the time CPAC, Civilian Police Accountability Council, was going on, and it was, yeah, it was a tremendous amount of work. And I think this is like the first fruit of the victory in that, and it wouldn't have been possible without the electoral victory in the mayor's race last year. So this is really important.
And that's the whole point, that this struggle is taking place on many fronts to control the police, to elect a progressive city council, to elect a progressive pro-working class, pro-people mayor, change the courts, to change the bureaucracy, Anita, to change every single aspect of the society that you can while you can, because the right is trying to grab school boards and so on and so forth. In Columbus, Anita, another glaring and very sad, tragic example happened with the killing, the murder of Tamika Young, Takia Young. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Her funeral was
Sure.
yesterday.
Yes, she was a 21-year-old. She was 6 months pregnant with a baby daughter that the whole family was looking forward to welcoming in November. She has two little boys, as you could see in that picture. And she was just grocery shopping, and she was in her car getting ready to go, and some employee came out and accused her of shoplifting. Actually, it turned out that's probably not shoplifting at all. They found no evidence of that. But within 35 seconds, that woman was dead, shot to death by a cop that just seems so aggressive. We saw the body cam. The incident took place August 24th, but it's taken a couple of weeks to really hit home because we did not see the body cam footage until just last week. And it's just outrageous. This man, this police officer had no reason at all to use deadly force against this woman. It's just so tragic. And he's violating the very rules that Blendon Township, he's a township police officer because he's in a very close by suburb of Columbus. He violated all of the rules that Blendon Township police officers are supposed to be following. So it really looks like he should be, and we are, Ohio District of the CPUSA is also demanding that he be fired and then arrested and prosecuted for murder. By the way, to add insult to murder, the police department in this case decided not to release the man's name, the officer's name who murdered, because of they invoked Marcy's law, which was a law that's supposed to protect crime victims. So they're alleging that this police officer was, a victim of a crime. But the police, I mean, just the body cam footage shows you that it was his own fault. He was the one that was at fault here, getting in front of her car and not leaving the scene, not getting out of the way as police, uh, rules say that he should have. So it's just an outrageous situation, and people in Columbus are very angry, and we've been through this so many times in at least 6 of these really atrocious killings of Black unarmed people in the last couple of years since George Floyd was murdered. So it just does not seem to end, but we're going to follow through on this one.
You heard what she said. Since George Floyd was murdered, our condolences go out to the family of Takia Young. And we know and hope that the party in Columbus will continue to join the coalitions that are emerging in that fight, work with the African American and other communities in trying to bring justice to these outrageous murders that have taken place in that city and across the country. On Thursday, the UAW is set to strike. Scott, one of the big issues there is two-tier wages, where they pay younger workers sometimes half, sometimes two-thirds of what they're paying older workers. And we hear that Ford has kind of offered little hints at negotiations, but the other two of the big three are not. It looks like there's going to be a strike, according to what we're hearing. What do you
Yeah.
think, Scott?
I mean, obviously, I hope that the workers get what they are justly demanding. without having to go on strike. I don't think anybody wants a strike to happen, but people are fed up with the two-tier wage system, with the lack of a cost of living increase. It's nonsense. And this two-tier question is a huge one because it's not just auto workers. It happens all over the place, in unions and in a lot of non-union jobs. So if you think about, let me give you an example. There's a CVS distribution warehouse in my town. Before the pandemic and before the um, sort of crunch in the labor market, they were hiring people starting at 14, moving up to $15 an hour. A year later, they were hiring people starting at 18, moving up to $19 an hour. So that's also a two-tier wage system. And um, you know, if you're getting paid less than somebody else for doing the same work, that's not fair. And it's great to see the members of UAW taking up that injustice, really fighting it, understanding that it's an attack on the ability of workers to unite. Right? It's a way of dividing people. So, yeah, of course we wish them the best. We stand with the UAW workers in solidarity, and if you're out on the picket lines, we'll see you there.
This coming Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we're holding a national membership meeting to discuss how we can get on the picket lines and give concrete support to that strike. So look out for us at CPUSA at cpusa.org. I'm sorry. Look for us at cpusa.org or write to us at cpusa at cpusa.org if you want further information about that strike. And by the way, 3 or 4 days later, we are coming to New York to a national mobilization to end the use of fossil fuels. And there are going to be tens of thousands, if not more, people marching for our right to breathe, marching for our right to live in places where we're not burning up with 105, 110 degree humidity, for our right to live in safe conditions. And we're going to have a party delegation contingent at that march. And we invite you to come to New York. You're coming from Virginia, North Carolina, or Ohio, or Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania. If you're coming from Maryland or Connecticut, New England, come on down. Join us on the 17th. Let's move now to our mailbag. We got an interesting question this week. Anita, why do you feel that communism would better serve the middle and working classes? While I absolutely loathe the two-party system, I'm not convinced communism would do better. I'm not seeing any clear messaging from you guys about how your commitment would keep us safer from those who continue to corrupt and bleed our country. So what would you do different than the bourgeoisie is doing now?
Well, I guess it's pretty basic. It's people before profits, as our old slogan goes, people and planet before profits. Communism isn't, a third party. We have the Communist Party as you can see it as a third party, but communism is, we want to replace the capitalist system where things are, work is accomplished and appropriated by a small group of ruling class individuals who take the surplus value from the workers. We would envision a system where instead of that kind of profit basis, work is planned by the working class as a whole and serves to benefit the people. And human needs will take precedence over the needs of individuals, hoarding of wealth would no longer be permitted. So I think it's quite different than just saying the two-party system and communism. It's capitalism versus communism here. It is still, as we have said, perfectly reasonable to expect a small d democracy in a communist system, because it would be really the people's will being expressed in the way work was organized.
How the people's will be expressed in the way work is organized. Isn't that the key issue, Cameron?
Exactly.
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, I was thinking of other things about this question, but yeah, I mean the key issue is working people and their allies, including small business owners and stuff like that, and middle forces, um, determining how the country is run, but working people in the first place, how work is done, what laws are in place, and how they're enforced and all the rest of it. Um, I was a little not clear to me what this person is referring to when they talk about the middle and lower classes or those who continue to corrupt and bleed our country. But I was wondering if they were talking about if this is sort of referring to the way the right wing tries to, and well, really the big capitalists try to, um, bring middle forces into their coalition. And maybe that person is asking whether our party will serve interests of people like with small businesses and such. And I think we would, because the big issue right now is these big corporations are crushing everyone. Um, but I
Okay.
agree with what Anita said. Sorry.
Thank you. Scott, I heard you trying to get in on the news.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the question of democracy is not a question of how many parties you have. You can have democracy with one, two, five, 10, none. Uh, so something Anita mentioned is we look at the capitalist class, the ruling class, which uses our two-party system, takes advantage of it to limit the expression of the people's will, to limit our power, to limit democracy. So we don't, unlike some other forces, we don't target the two-party system. We would like there to be an opening for a labor-led people's party, a party that would authentically represent the interests of working people. But the enemy behind all of this is the capitalist class, and that's what makes us communists. The understanding that to change how society works, we have to change who's in control. We have to replace the capitalist class with the working class, and also having a plan to get there. That's the other part. But yeah, no, it's not just the two-party system. It's the capitalist class that's bleeding us, and we got to get to them.
And Scott has the last word. Thank you for joining us this week. Until next week, stay strong, stay safe, stay in the fight. We hope to see you next Wednesday at our members meeting to prepare for the UAW strike. And if you can't make that, we certainly hope to see you on the 17th here in New York City for the climate march. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Later, comrades.